Good evening, everyone. And tonight we're going to talk about debt, slavery in the ancient Near East and in the Bible. So we're going to, again, as usual, we're going to find our starting point is biblical text. Like, we're not going to just talk about the ancient Near East and then, oh, in the Bible also, okay, but we're going to talk about biblical texts in the context of the ancient Near East and approaches to debt slavery in the ancient Near East. Now, I'm going to request everyone to mute yourselves. I can't mute you because I'm not in charge of the session, okay? So please mute yourselves so that no background noise interferes. We're going to start just to remind ourselves about the general rules of debt slavery. It's assumed debt slavery, right? It doesn't go into this is how this happened. We're going to take a look and through, as we explore this, we're going to see in biblically where the situation is described as opposed to the laws pertaining to. Okay, so let's start with the Shemitah Laws in Shemot, in Exodus. That's Exodus 21:1. So it's Shemot Chaf Aleph. Aleph. Okay, here we are. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Shemitah of the slave, right? So it's the sabbatical year for the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave. Now, I want to just say, and we're going to see this. I'm not sure if we're going to see this in the text I gave you, but in general, there's a difference also in general in the ancient Near East. There's a difference between a slave and what we might call a debt slave, an indentured servant. Okay, so these are two different classes of people. Throughout the ancient Near East, it works this way. If you are kind of from the tribe, as it were, you can become a slave through debt. If you are a slave, you've been brought in from some foreign nation through conquest or capture, things like that, okay? So I'm going to start reading. These are the laws that you should place before them. Ki tikneh eved ivri 6 shanim ya'avod, uvashvi'it yitzeh lechofshi chinam. So if you purchase a Hebrew slave, he will work for 6 years, and on the 7th, he will go free for free. What does that mean? It isn't clear. We're going to see that it's possible that what it means is his debt is free and clear, right? Perhaps that's what it means. In other words, he hasn't just, in the ancient Near East, there were different ways that someone could be a debt slave. They could be a debt slave as collateral for the loan. So usually like a member of the family, they have their son or daughter work at the house of, essentially be a slave to the creditor, and that's collateral for the loan. In other words, it pays off nothing. In other cases, it would pay off the interest and not the capital. Okay, so what's going on here? Truth is, we don't know because it's assumed that we know why this person's a slave. Okay, it's actually assuming that you bought them, really. I mean, that's what it's saying, you bought them. But it's possible, and I think, I'm trying to remember which pieces of Hammurabi I gave you, but there are parts of the Hammurabi code where it talks about you get like a deal with a merchant where there's the person who's working the field, there's the owner of the field, and there's the merchant. And there's a whole idea of, you sell for money, and that money you use to pay off the debt of the merchant, et cetera, et cetera. So it could be a situation like that where you're using the money to pay the debt and there's someone else in between. So Moshe Matitya here asked, are you identifying a debt slave with an Eved Ivri and a slave with an Eved Kanaani? Yes, I am saying that it's one can assume that the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave, has in some way sold himself or been sold out of debt, okay? And an Eved Kanaani, a Canaanite slave who is a slave in perpetuity, would be like a slave, a Wardum in Akkadian, okay? That class of slave, okay? Now, of course, we do have a law in the Bible that if a slave escapes to your town, you do not turn him over. That's in direct contradiction to Hammurabi, where if you don't turn a slave over, you're in big, big trouble, right? So biblically, if a slave escapes to your town, you are not allowed to turn him over. And that actually sounds like it's talking about any slave, which is interesting. But we're not talking about that right now. Okay, we're going to go on to this Hebrew slave. In bekapo yavo, bekapo yetze, in bali shahu v'yatsa ishto imo. So if he goes on his own, he goes out on his own. If he came with a wife, he can leave with his wife. Im adonav yitan lo isha v'yalda lo vanim uvanot ha'isha v'yalada tiyeh ladoneha v'hu yetze bekapo. Right. So if you give him like a slave wife, and then he has kids, the wife and his kids stay, and he goes. ואם אמור יאמר העבד אהבתי את אדוני את אשתי ואת בניי לא אצא חופשי והגישו אדוניו אל האלוהים והגישו אל הדלת או למזוזה ורצה אדוניו את אוזניו במרצע ועבדו לעולם. It's a classic case. He says, no, I now have a wife and children who I love. I don't want to leave them, so I will stay a slave forever. And then his master brings him to God, or in the traditional explanation, the judge, right? And he puts him in the door and he punctures his ear. And that's a sign that this guy's not going to be a slave forever. That's what we have in Shemot. Let's look at the rule in Exodus, and let's look at the rule in Devarim and Deuteronomy. So let's go to Deuteronomy. This is before we're going to talk about what the reality was in just a bit. Okay, so if we look at Devarim, Deuteronomy Tet Vav, that's 15:1. We're going to start from the beginning. Okay, for the 7th year, you're going to do Shemitah. V'zeh dvar haShemitah Shemot kol bal ma'aseh yado asher yasher bere'ehu lo yigos et re'ehu v'et achiv ki kara Shemitah l'Hashem. Now this is talking about debt, right? You have to erase all debt in the 7th year, right? So you're not allowed to oppress, to essentially to get, you're not allowed to ask for interest. Of course, interest is the killer, because traditionally also interest rates in the ancient Near East were 20% and up. So you've got an interest rate like that, you end up just paying off the interest. You will never pay off the debt. And as you fall behind on the interest, you lose more and more. And we'll see this in just a bit. But this was a classic problem in the ancient Near East, that you had these farmers, one bad crop year, and you're going to have a bad crop year, and you are sunk. It's the kind of debt you can't get out of. Okay, so no, you're not allowed to charge. You're not allowed to charge interest, or you're not allowed to be oppressive. It depends, if you want to, but it does sound like it's interest. Right? So who can you oppress? Who can you get like interest from? Is a foreigner, right? Not someone from your group, not from someone from Israel. And note also what that means is not someone who's sitting on his ancestral land. Right, so not someone who's where it's in a situation where it's a farmer on his ancestral land and you're doing this to him. Okay. Right, you're not going to have a poor person. Right. Okay. Right, we're going to skip a little bit ahead. You just have to listen to God, and then if we skip to Pasuk Zion to verse 7, right? Well, if you have a poor person, right, so you're not going to have a poor person, but you will have a poor person. Okay, so if you have a poor person in one of your gates, in one of your cities, in your land, okay, I'm skipping a little bit ahead, right? Right, don't make your heart hard, make your heart stubborn, and clench up your fist in front of your poor brethren. Okay, you should open your hand and give him, and you should not say, and I'm just going to paraphrase, what are you not supposed to say? Don't say a horrible, nasty, amoral thing that the 7th year is close, all right, and I don't want to give it to him because he's not going to pay it back because his debt's going to be forgiven, right? So this is the problem with let's open this up, okay? What's the issue here? we have a problem that people end up in debt, and they end up in debt. I admit, and here again, I'm going to keep on going because they are linked. Okay, in Pasuk Yud Bet in verse 12. Okay, Ki yimacher lecha achicha ivri o ivriya v'avatcha shesh shanim uv'shana shvi'it tishchena chofshi meimach. Right, so then you have the situation of a Hebrew slave who has 6 years, and then you have to send him free. When you send him free, you're not going to send him without anything. So you should give him, right, from your sheep, right, and from your, essentially from your grain and from your vineyard, which God has blessed you. Right, you should remember that you were a slave in Egypt, right? And then you have the same rule where he says he doesn't want to go out, and then you take his ear and pierce it. Okay. So here we have a situation. So on the one hand, you shouldn't let the debts are forgiven every 7 years, so you shouldn't have this sinking into debt. And the slaves are released after 7 years, not the same every 7 years, but after 7 years, right? They're released. So again, you don't have someone who's in slavery in perpetuity. All right. And this is trying to solve a problem that they really had in the ancient Near East. And we're going to look at how different places rather more Babylonia. We have a lot of stuff from Babylonia, a little bit of Nuzi, where they didn't try to solve it, where a farmer has a bad year, or in general, especially in old Babylonia, people's labor was worth more than land. Land wasn't actually worth that much. So they have a bad year, and then they need to borrow money for food, for crops, for animals. Even you see the people, they get animals for the land, and then they can kind of never get back on their feet. They're always going to grow fewer crops, and they will lose more and more of their land, lose more and more of them of their kids that they have to give as collateral or as debt slaves to work it off themselves. They themselves are going to have to go into debt slavery until you have the situation. And in general, the people who are buying it up are urban merchants, and they're buying up the land because they've got money to lend, or they've got animals to lend, to give rather, and they buy up more and more in the land, and the people end up as tenants on their own land. So this is a situation, if we want to look at the case in Nuzi, where the Hurrians did not do anything about this. They were apparently fine with this happening. If you look at your source sheets, at the end, it should be the end of your source sheets. Let me scroll down here. Oh, I'm in the wrong thing, excuse me. Let's see. For just a moment. Here we are. So if you go to the end of our source sheets, if you go to it's the 7th page of our source sheet, and this is a series of adoptions in Nuzi. Nuzi is, we've talked about them before. They're in Iraq. Okay, and let me see, I have the dates here as well from last
What
time.
page is it? What page is it on the page?
The date of Nuzi is 1450 to 1340. Okay, so we're talking late Bronze Age. All right, so that's
no. What page is written on the page?
Oh, like 148 is written on the page, and this page 7. Yeah. Okay. So if these are tablets of adoption, I've mentioned this before, in Nuzi, adoption did a lot of heavy lifting. They bought slaves they weren't kind of supposed to buy through adoption. They sold land through adoption. Why? Because there was a custom that you did not sell ancestral land. If you had ancestral land, you did not sell it. So what do? No problem. You adopt the guy who's buying it, and you turn it into an adoption contract. And that's what we have here. Okay, we have a series of adoption contracts. I skipped, there are a whole bunch of them from the same family. If you look and see what we have here, this is an extract from a book by Maynard Maidman, a Nuzi text, and they're used as historical evidence. And here you can see that the title of the chapter is The Decline and Fall of a Nuzi Family. Okay, and it's a series of adoptions of the same guy named Enamati. So what I have here is the first one, tablet of adoption of Hishmaiah, son of Itchista, and of Ushaniah, daughter of Enamilki. They adopted Enamati, son of Techeptilah. Hishmaiah and Ushaniah gave to Enamati as his inheritance share a 1.6 homer field in the town of Tenti. Okay, so they're already giving him his inheritance, which is a field. And what does Enamati give as a gift? And Enamati gave to Hishmaiah and to Ushaniah as their gift 1 garment, 1 leather siyanatu blanket, and 5 sheep. Okay, should this field have claimants, then whichever amongst them is present shall clear this field and give it to Enamati. Right? Okay, so in other words, this is note in passage 34 to 35, where the number 34 to 35, it says, Enamati dragged his hem in the presence of these witnesses. If you've ever been to the Bible Lands Museum, I think they have this, you'll see a mark of a fringe on the clay as a signature. They took the fringe of the garment and they put it on the clay, and that was a way to sign something. He dragged his hem. He's agreeing to this agreement. Of course, this is very possibly connected to the custom of taking the fringe and kissing the Torah with it, right? That at least that connection has been made. This was an ancient way of signing a document with the fringe of one's garment. If we remember with Yaakov, how he gives his fringe is one of the things that he gives to Tamar as an identifier. You guys remember that, right? He has to get it back. So that's what's going on here. And I always forget which doc. Here we are. How did I already lose the place? Excuse me. Okay. All right, and that's the first of a whole series of adoptions. And now on the next page, it's the page is written on it is 159. It's page 8 of your handout. We see the last of the adoptions, right? It's it's a tablet of adoption of Akiah, son of Itchista. It's a brother of Hishmaiah, because these are family fields. He adopted Enamati, son of Techeptilah. Now Akiah gave to Enamati as his inheritance share this land, a 2 homer field, et cetera, to the east of the road. So he gives his field. And Enamati gave to Akiah as his gift 5 sheep, 5 goats, and 20 minas of tin. Right? And then the next document we have is finally a promise from the son of Itchista, another son of Itchista, from Sharashaduni. I shall not raise a claim against them, whatever our Wiru land, et cetera, which Hishmaiah and Akiah, my brothers, have given to Enamati, son of Techeptilah. In other words, there's been a whole series of adoptions where they've been selling off their ancestral land bit by bit to this guy, Enamati. And finally, the youngest brother says, I'm not going to make problems. If I start making problems, I will owe you money. I promise I'm not going to make issues. One assumes that he was bought off in some way to give this promise. But what you have is a family that was, one assumed, owners of the land, and now they're simply going to be tenant farmers. Okay, because they had to sell off the land gradually. Once you start selling off, it's very hard to get out of the situation where you're going to need to keep selling off your land. And the idea is that not only do they become tenant farmers, but in the end, many of them become debt slaves. It actually helps us understand a little bit better. And here I'm going to do our first piece of narrative. I admit it's our weakest one, but it's still interesting. So if we look at Bereishit Mem Zion, so that's Genesis 47. Okay. Yud 18 to 19. Okay, and we're talking about, this is after, by the way, after Joseph's brothers are already in Egypt, right? They're in Goshen. They're shepherds, right? They have cattle, right? But Egyptians are farmers, and they don't have food because of the drought. And they gradually sell off everything to Yosef in order to get food. The final thing they sell off, right? It says, "Vatitom hashana hahi," and that year completed. Vayavo elav b'shana shinit. They came to him in the second year. Vayomer lo nechached me'adoni ki im tam hakesef umekna be'ema el adoni lo nishar lifnei adoni bilti im gviatenu ve'admatenu. So they said, okay, we're not going to deny it. We ate the money's gone. We don't have money anymore. We already gave you our cattle in the previous year. All we have left are our bodies and our land. Lama namut le'necha gam anachnu gam admatenu. Why should we die before you, ourselves and our land? Kne otanu vet admatenu balachem. Buy us and our land with bread. And we and our land will be slaves for Paro. And give us seed, and we will live and we will not die. And the land will not be desolate. Now, of course, this passage is doing two things. It's explaining how the palace has all these corvée slaves, all these corvée servants from the citizens of Egypt, right? But it's also explaining an agricultural reality, which is that as soon as you're selling the land, you're essentially selling yourself. Once the land is not yours, you are the as a tenant farmer, you're almost a slave to the person who owes the land. There isn't that big a difference. Okay, once you start selling off the land, you're working the land for this guy that owns the land, right? You're not free anymore. Okay, so there's this reality, and note that this reality does not affect Yosef's brothers. Why? Because they're not farmers, right? They have cattle. Up until this point, the whole story, in terms of Bereishit going into Shemot, Genesis going into Exodus, right? The whole story is here are this family that have traditionally been shepherds. They've always kept cattle. That's been their thing, right? When they leave Egypt, where are they going? They're gonna be farmers. Once you go to a land where you're gonna be farmers, you gotta handle this debt thing somehow, right? Because it's a feature of life, of agricultural life in the ancient Near East. Now, we saw what happens in Newsy where no one really handles it, okay? What are the limits in the ancient Near East that we see, both in standard law and then how is it handled on a regular basis? So let's take a look at Hammurabi. So if you go back to our source sheets, okay? So if you go back to the first page, and you'll see that I highlighted. So it's the first page of your handout. It's page 168 of Pritchard, Ancient Near Eastern Texts, Code of Hammurabi, passage 48. If a debt is outstanding against a seigneur is an Awilum, and Adad has inundated his field, or a flood has ravaged it, or through lack of water, grain has not been produced in the field, he shall not make any return of grain to his creditor in that year. He shall cancel his contract tablet, and he shall pay no interest for that year. So here is one protection that we have. Now, again, what we're looking at here is, I just want to remind you that the law of Hammurabi is not exactly a law code the way we think of it, right? But it is apparently based on some kind of common law. It does give us a sense of what was possibly being applied, okay? And the idea is in a case of a natural disaster that lasts for a year, you are not responsible for the interest. Because remember, people would borrow the capital, and the main problem was paying off the interest, okay? The main problem that would keep from year to year was paying off the interest as it, that was really substantial. So no interest for that year. Okay, because it's an act of God. It's an act of God, literally, right? It's an act of a God, and you can't respond. You can't be responsible. If by the way, if the owner of the land was negligent and allowed it to be flooded, because he didn't build a dam properly and he doesn't get the out. But let's go on to the next passage that we have from Code of Hammurabi. So this is the second page of your handout, is page 170 of Pritchard. So here we have several cases that gives us a better sense of what this reality was, what kind of the rules around it. If an Awilam held a debt of grain or money against another Awilam and distrained someone as a pledge, he took a person as his pledge. Usually, the person that was taken as a pledge was not the debtor himself, but it was a child, a member of his household. It could have been a slave sometimes. And the pledge has then died a natural death in the house of his distrainer. That case is not subject to claim. In other words, the person died and the creditor was not to blame, then no harm, no foul. I mean, harm, yes, but no harm, no foul. If the pledge has died from beating or abuse in the house of his distrainer, in other words, the creditor who took him on. Now, actually, I'm going to correct myself. It's not necessarily the creditor who took him on. It could have been someone else who paid the creditor in exchange for having this pledge. In other words, someone else could have given the creditor money for the year, and now the pledge is by this other person. So it doesn't have to be the creditor. If the pledge died from beating or abuse, the owner of the pledge shall prove it against his merchant, and if it was the Awilam's son, they shall put his son to death. If it was the Awilam's slave, he shall pay 1/3 mina of silver and also forfeit everything else that he lent. Let me explain again. Here is a case of an Awilam, a free man, and he owes money. Okay, and Awilam is the highest level of free man, right? So he owes money, and he takes his son and he gives it to this guy as a pledge or as payment for the interest, right? And possibly payment for part of the capital, who knows? And this kid dies because he was beaten, right? And for that, okay, the punishment is severe. It's an eye for an eye, right? They're going to kill they'll kill the merchant's son. Okay, so in exchange for the Awilam losing his son, they'll kill the merchant's son. He has no right to beat this person to death, okay, even though he is a pledge, right? If it was the Awilam slave, he has to pay him 1/3 mina of silver and also forfeit everything else that he lent. So if he's a slave, he has to pay for the damage done to the debtor and also forgive his debt, okay? So you can see there's an idea here. Yes, you owe a debt, but you have rights. As a free man, you're not like a lower level person. You have certain rights, okay? And also it limits what you can do to this pledge. If an obligation came due against an Awilam and he sold the services of his wife, his son, or his daughter, or he has been bound over to service, they shall work in the house of their purchaser or obligee for 3 years, with their freedom reestablished in the 4th year. That sounds very familiar, right? So if he gives one of them over for the debt, 3 years is the limit, okay? When a male slave or a female slave has been bound over to service, if the merchant foreclosed, he may sell him with no possibility of his being reclaimed. If an obligation came due against an Awilam and he has accordingly sold the services of his female slave who bore him children, the owner of the female slave may repay the money which the merchant paid out and thus redeem his female slave. So what it sounds like here is if the merchant has the right to simply take, you defaulted on your loan, okay, the merchant can keep the slave. If it's a slave woman who's borne you children, so you have a special interest in getting her back, right? You're allowed to pay the merchant and kind of force him to give you the slave back. In other words, it's on the one hand, it's an exchange of goods. On the other hand, the merchant doesn't have a choice. He has to sell her back. I'm going to take a pause here because I see things in chat. Let me take a look. Okay, is there a connection between the legalistic use of the garment fringe and the commandment of tzitzit? That I don't know. I have to say I don't know about it. I have to look into that in terms of the actual commandment of tzitzit, that there be a connection between the legalistic use of of the French, I don't know. Is the word Tashem in Genesis 47 related to the word Shemitah? No, it should not be, right? Shemitah is Shemot. Shemitah is Shin Mem Tet is the root, and Tashem should be, I think it's Yud Shin Mem. I think it's Yud Shin Mem, but I'm not 100% sure. But I believe that is the root for that word. Interesting that length of servitude is not proportional to the debt. Right. So that's why what it sounds like is the servitude, the length of servitude seems to be as collateral, right? So that's why it seems that it's very possible that these people are collateral as opposed to or paying off only the interest, right? They're not paying off the capital, they're paying off the interest, or they're serving as collateral for the loan. Because otherwise it doesn't make much sense. So let's continue with, I believe I have one more. Do I have? No. So let's continue on. Yeah, sorry.
What percentage of the population was a slave population in these societies?
You mean real slaves? You mean like brought in from outside?
No, at any time, how many people, what percentage of the population?
This is the story. This is a great question because it brings me to my next point. You know, the difference between a good question is a question I know the answer to. A great question takes me to my next point. So that was a great question. So, so the issue, what would happen is, particularly in ancient Babylonia, was that once this situation got out of hand, the king would step in and call a moratorium on these loans. All right. This didn't happen everywhere. So, for example, again, in Newsy, this sort of thing, that did not happen. But when things were really getting out of hand, and I'm going to bring an example in just a second from your source sheet. But there is something called a Mesharim edict, right? Mesharim, it was because it's from, they used to use Mesharim Shakanum, right, to establish justice, right? Shakanum as in shochen, right? And Mesharim, as in, you know, right? Mesharim. So, so Mesharim being justice. So there's this a few generations after Hammurabi, they started having these edicts. We're going to look at a piece of the first one, okay, which meant to reestablish justice in the land. And part of reestablishing justice in the land was canceling these debts, okay, among other things. But so let's take a look. Let's take a look at a passage from the first. Now, I wish I could have brought you some things from the entire text. I brought it for you from a book called Debt, Slavery in Israel and the Ancient Near East. It's a comprehensive book, but in disappointing ways, I have to say. Like, in other words, I'm just giving you a heads up because I read it. I was like, oh, great. And I read it, and it doesn't ask or answer the questions that were interesting to me. So I was, if you want, like, it's not, did help a little in this class, but it's really not the main background for this class. It doesn't answer a lot of the questions that you have with these edicts and with these, instead it kind of goes into the details of the law and the loans, etc. So here we have, I'm in the wrong text, excuse me. Okay, here we are. Okay, so I'm on page 5 of your handout. It's page 88 in the book, Debt, Slavery in Israel and the Ancient Near East. Okay, and I'm looking at the highlighted section, passage 20, which is 20 in Ami Saduka's edict. The first edict we have, and in fact, the only edict that we actually possess, because we have references to the edicts of different kings, which were called Mesharim edicts and were similar, right? But the only one where we really have the text, as far as I know, is Ami Saduka's edict. He was, if I remember correctly, I think he was the great-grandson or the great-great-grandson of Hammurabi. He lived, let me give you the year, Depending on the chronology you use, he's the first Babylonian dynasty. So he's 1646 to 1626 or 1582 to 1562. Okay. So if a liability had bound a free man from Numchia, a free man from Amut Balam, a free man from Ida Maris, a free man from Uruk, a free man from Isin, a free man from Kusuru, a free man from Malgum, and consequently the free man had pledged himself, his wife, or his children for silver into bondage or as a pledge, in the event the king again brought law and order back to the land, he is free. His freedom is once again established. Okay, so here notice that it has two restrictions. One is location, and one is class. It's no Welam. It's not some kind of lower level person, and obviously it's not a regular slave. Okay, he's bound himself. He is now free. Next passage. This is on the next page. If someone from a position of slavery who was houseborn of a free man from Numchia, a free man from Amut Balam, a free man from Idamar, a free man from Uruk, a free man from Isin, a free man from Kisur, a free man from Malgum, is sold for silver, or is given into bondage, or has been left as a pledge, his freedom is not restored again. In other words, this is talking about a slave. Okay, a slave who is from a household, and as a pledge, he's given over to the creditor or to someone who's paid money to the creditor. That slave is not free. He's a slave. Okay, he's a slave, and that's not the point. The point is to free these freemen landholders. Okay, and in fact, we see that through old Babylonian history, at intervals, you have kings issue these edicts. And the assumption is that these edicts were issued when things got really bad, when they started to see that this was a real problem. And the question always is, why? Did they care? Was this economic? Was it part of propaganda? There seems to be a general consensus that the very first one of these edicts, the one that we just read, a lot of it was propaganda and showing, look, I am restoring justice to the land. But that after that, and once that had been set as a precedent, it was a way of handling this economic crisis. Why was it an economic crisis? Now, I'm basing myself on, this is a question, it's not obvious, right? Because what does it matter who owns the land? Was this a real issue? And the theory is that, yes, it was a real issue. Why? Because the idea was that a lot of the land that labor was scarcer than land. And what you had were these urban creditors. They were merchants, right? They buy up the land and they're getting things back in terms of interest. They have slaves, they're doing ways of kind of making the debt worthwhile, but the land isn't being farmed the way it was when the family was on its own land, when the entire family was on its own land, and they had a real reason to get the crops going. They owned their land, and so the land was not being worked the way it used to be worked. There's less farming going on. There's a possibility that there's less there's just less economic activity because more people are in this kind of servitude situation. Also, if you're a king, it means the merchants are getting much stronger, and they're a class that's getting stronger now. So instead of having this landed peasant class, you get this stronger and stronger merchant class. If you're a king, that's concerning, right? To have this very strong class where the wealth is being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and it's much easier for them to make problems for you. So that's another possibility in terms of why kings felt they had to put a stop to this on a regular basis. So, excuse me just a second. So why, in such a case, so in this case, we have two different options, right? To prevent this issue, we have what we have in biblical law, which is that at regular intervals, these debts are forgiven, okay? And we have what's going on in Old Babylonia. It stops later because, and the actual, I read a theory that the reason it stops for a while is because labor becomes more available, becomes easier to hire people to work, and so the land becomes more valuable, and they don't have the problem as much, but then it comes back. So you have through the ages in different places, different rulers saying, okay, you guys in this place, that is forgiven. And the problem with that is that it adds a lot of uncertainty in the system. Like anyone who deals with economics knows that people hate uncertainty. And it means that if you do business, it's a big part of the cost of doing business. I'm lending money, but I don't know if next year the king's going to forgive all my debts, right? Like all the debts that are due me, all the money that's supposed to be coming to me, and then what do I have? So it adds uncertainty into the market, and then it depends on like how important is it for these merchants to be happy? Is it really going to stop them loaning money? Probably not, etc. So it depends where you are in an economy. Whereas biblically, where every 7th year you forgive the debt. So on the one hand, there's no uncertainty. You know exactly what's going on. On the other hand, what happens in the 6th year? Who's lending money? No one, right? Which is why you need the commandment saying, guys, don't be a Ben Blial, don't be a nasty, horrible person and say I'm not going to lend in the 6th year, which frankly is very, very logical. Right? When you know that the 7th year, all debts are going to be forgiven, it's very logical to not lend in the 6th year. The problem is that stops the entire economic system in the 6th year. You can't do that, right? So each system comes with its own issues. Now let's take a look, because we have biblical stories that are actually examples, or kind of examples. We'll see one of them is an example of a mix of these two systems, and the other one is absolutely the system that we saw in Old Babylonia. Let's take a quick look. So let's take a look at Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, right? 34, Lamed Daled, 8-17. Let's just look at Chet. We'll start from Chet and just keep going.
Wait, chapter 8?
No, chapter 34. Chapter 34, verse 8. I'm going to take a pause I see there's some questions. Is the 7th year of servitude for an Israelite on the same clock as Shemitah, or its own starting point? It's its own starting point. It's its own starting point. Okay, so Yirmiyahu, right. Yirmiyahu Lamed Daled, Jeremiah 34. Here we are. Right, we're reading from 8, from Chet. Okay. Hadavar hasher haya el Yirmiyahu me'et Hashem achrei krot hamelech Tzidkiyahu brit et kol ha'am asher b'Yerushalayim lekro lehem dror. So this was the word that came to Yirmiyahu from God after Tzidkiyahu made a treaty with the entire nation in Jerusalem to declare them free, dror, right? Which means everyone goes, and then it continues, it explains, L'shalach ishet avdo v'ishet shivchato ha'ivri va'ivriya chofshim, that every man should release his slave and maidservant, the Hebrew and the Hebrewess, right? They both of them free. So it's being very clear. We're talking about Israelite slaves and maidservants that they have, and now they made an agreement with the king to set them free. Okay. Vayishme'u. So it's very similar to what we've been talking about in terms of things were getting really bad, and he's like, this is no good. And he said to all the creditors, now we're agreeing, you set them free. Okay. Vayishme'u chol hasarim v'chol ha'am asher ba'u b'brit l'shalach ishet avdo v'ishet shivchato chofshim. All the officers, you also have people, important people, right? All the ministers, all the ministers and all the nation that entered this treaty, listen, they agreed, right? To release each person their slave, each person their maidservant free, and not to make them serve them anymore. And they listened to it and they freed them. They released them. And they backtracked afterwards. They took back the slaves and the maidservants that they had set free, and they captured them as slaves and maidservants. So those people who had agreed with Tzidkiyahu, they're like, ha ha ha, not really, and they recaptured them. Vayidvar Hashem el Yirmiyahu meit Hashem lemor, and that's the word of the Lord was to Yirmiyahu from God, saying, Ko hamar Hashem el Yisrael, so says the Lord God of Israel, Anochi karati britit avotechem b'yom hatzi'i otam me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim lemor. I made a treaty with your forefathers on the day I took them out of Egypt from the house of slaves, saying, Miket sheva shanim tishalchu ish et achiv v'hivri asher yimacher lecha. So I made a treaty with them that after 7 years, each person should free his brother, the Hebrew that is sold to you, and he should only work for you 6 years, and then send him free from you. And your fathers didn't listen to me, and they didn't, incline their ears. But tashuvu atem hayom v'tasu et yishar b'yinai l'kodror ish l're'ehu v'techotu brit l'vanai b'bayit asher nekresh mi'alav. Right, but you returned today, and you did the correct thing to declare freedom for each person for his friend, and you made a treaty in front of me in the house that my name is called on, right? In the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. But tashuvu v'tachalu et shmi, and you went back and you desecrated my name. But tashivu ishet avdo v'ishet shikato shashilach, and he repeats, and then you went back and you took them and you captured them for slaves and maidservants. So here we have a connection of the two things. It seems like what happened was that Tzidkiyahu, without connection to the 6 or 7 years, Tzidkiyahu said, "This is what's going on. Cannot stand." We don't know. It doesn't sound like anyone was keeping the 7th year. It doesn't sound like they were paying attention to that. But Tzidkiyahu stepped in as king and said, "Okay, guys, treaty time. You guys are going to forgive these debts. You guys are going to send these people home." And they did. And then they went and they recaptured them. And Yirmiyahu was connecting it to the biblical law, right? And he's connecting it to the biblical law for a very specific reason, because what he's going to say is, so therefore, so says the Lord, you didn't listen to me to declare freedom, each person for his brother, etc. So I'm going to call for you freedom, right? To the sword, to sickness, and to hunger. I'm going to make you a shocking horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. So you won't call freedom. I'm going to call it freedom from my protection, and I'm going to let everything have their free way with you, including famine and disease and the sword and war. Right? That's what you're going to get, because there is a commandment here that you're breaking. Right? That's why it's important to connect it to the commandment, to the 7th year commandment. But it looked like what Tzidkiyahu was doing originally didn't actually necessarily connect to the 7th year in particular. He was like, guys, release them. You can't keep doing this. Okay, it's gotten to be an impossible situation. Let's take another look at another case where we have a similar situation, and that is Nehemiah. You guys who have learned Ezra and Nehemiah with me know I am a big Nehemiah fan. He is swell. Okay, Nehemiah is cool because, and I've mentioned this before, he realized, actually Ezra also does this, but Nehemiah relies very much on calling on people's shared values to get them to agree to what he wants, and that really helps him. If we can, I've done this, I've mentioned this, that in terms of leadership, if we can compare Moshe as a leader to Nehemiah as a leader, Moshe, it's very, very difficult, because Moshe is constantly telling Bnei Israel, like, what are you doing? Like, this is God. Why are you not listening? There's a constant clash. There's no sense that Moshe can call on a shared ethic that people listen to. But when we get to Nehemiah, he really can, right? We have the sense that he can say to them, look, and let's see what he does here. Okay, so I'm reading Nehemiah, Nehemiah 5 from the beginning of the chapter. And the cry of the nation and their wives was great about their brothers, the Jews, right? The Jews, the Judeans. ויש אשר אומרים, בנינו ובנותינו אנחנו רבים, ונכחד הגן ונאכלה ונחיה. And there are among them that say, we have a lot of sons and daughters, and we need to take grain and eat and live. ויש אשר אומרים, שדותינו וכרמנו ובתינו אנחנו ערבים. And there are those who are saying, we are putting up as collateral, or essentially losing, giving away our fields and our vineyards and our houses, and we'll take and we'll take grain just for hunger. Okay, so there are two things here. The first thing seems to be, we've got a lot of sons and daughters, so we're going to give you them as debt slaves, and we're going to at least get some grain, right? And the other one is, we're going to give our fields, and well, let's get some grain. And note, they're getting grain to eat, which is a big problem. They're not getting seed to plant. They're getting food to eat. They can never pay these debts. All right. And they said, some people are saying, we borrowed money to pay off the tax, the king's tax, right? And therefore we're losing our fields and our vineyards, right? We have to give up our fields and our vineyards. So there are different situations. Some people need it for money. Some people need it to pay off the tax. These are all things they're never going to get back. These aren't investments. These are things that they're doing just so they can live. All right. And they're giving away their kids. Now, giving away their kids, I'm exaggerating a little, right? The kids are not true slaves, right? But probably they're not expecting to see them again. And also, if they are giving away their sons and daughters aren't helping them on the farm either. Right, so they're getting just worse and worse. They're giving away their fields. They're giving away their children. It's terrible, and we're going to get to something worse. Okay, we're going to get to something worse. Vata kimsar achenu b'sarenu, and now our flesh is like the flesh of our brothers. Kivnehem banenu, our sons are like their sons. V'hine anachnu kovshim et banenu v'et bnotenu lavadim, and behold, here we are capturing our sons and daughters as slaves. And some of our daughters are being captured, quote unquote, and we have no power to stop it. And our fields and our vineyards belong to others. So here's this horrible situation, and it's being emphasized. It's the same people, right? Jews and Jews, Judeans and Judeans, right? And they're like, and our sons and daughters are now slaves. We're losing our fields, and our daughters are being attacked, and we can't save them, right? Which is also a big part of it. All right. Note that it's not just the nation that's yelling to us; it's the wives, right? Which is interesting that specifically the wives are calling to Nehemiah here for help. And I was very angry when I heard their cry and these things. So, and he took counsel with himself, okay, and he took these chorim and skanim, these high level people to task. And I said to them, Masha ish b'chivatem noshim, v'ten alem kila gdola. I said, you are really, really oppressing your brethren. You each person is really oppressing his brother. And I had a large audience, right? V'amra lahem, anachnu kaninu et achenu haYehudim hanimkarim legoyim kedevanu. I said, back in Babylonia, he doesn't say back in Babylonia, but this is what he means. Back in Babylonia, we would buy our brothers, the Jews, that were sold to the nations, right? So now you're going to sell your brethren, and we should also buy them? What the heck? What's going on, right? And they were quiet. They had nothing to say. Okay, this is a classic example. Nehemiah is calling on a clear, how clearly wrong this is, and they recognize the wrongness of it. right? No, we don't know how Tzidkiyahu in his day got people to agree to give up their slaves, but Nehemiah is getting them to agree by showing them how wrong they are, all right? And they really don't, and in front of other people, right? And they don't have anything to say. Va'omar, lo tov hadavar asher atem osim. And I said, it's not good, this thing that you're doing. Halo b'yirat Eloheinu telechu b'cherpat hagoyim oivenu. He said, you should go in with the fear of God, from the shame of our enemies, the nations around us. V'gam ani achai unarai noshim bahem kesef v'dagam nazvana et hamasha hazeh. He said, also I, so apparently also, Nehemiah himself was a creditor. I, my brethren, and my boys, it doesn't seem to be servants, it's like his entourage, right? We're also, they've also been getting they've had debts that they've been collecting on. Okay, we're also going to leave it. We're gonna forgive our debts. Okay, it's another thing that Nehemiah does, sending an example. Hashivu na lahem kayom stotehem karmehem zetehem uvatehem. Now, please return to them. It's kind of let us return to them. The na, we always translate it as please. It's not really please, right? But it's a little bit. It's like kind of a exhortative. Okay, you should return to them today. Their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their homes. And the silver and the grain and the grapes and the olive crops that you are taking from them, that you are kind of charging them for the loan. Vayomru nashiv umehem lo nevakesh, and they said, we will return it and we will not ask for it from them. Ken naseh kasher ata omer, so we shall do just as you say. V'krat kohanim v'ashbiyim, and I called the kohanim, the priests, and I made them swear, lasot kadavar hazeh, to do this thing. Okay, and in fact, it seems like they did it. It seems like they did it. It seems like they didn't reverse it, unlike with Tzidkiyahu. And here we see another case where, without reference to any specific sabbatical year, there's a situation going on where you have the poor and you have the rich, and the poor are getting poorer and they're never going to get out of it. And it's getting worse and worse. And they really are being oppressed. And their children are given into the hands of these people who are their creditors. And Nehemiah steps in and says, you are being wrong. What you are doing is not good. And they can't say otherwise, and they recognize it and they listen to him. It's part of the power of Nehemiah, but it's also part of the power that at this point in Jewish history, this is the beginning of the Second Temple period, at this point in Jewish history, there is a shared value system that he can call upon, right? At this point, it's not just Nehemiah. He can go to them, right? I think that Moshe, as a leader in the desert, he's got a real issue, and he's got a real problem. And he can't draw on what Nehemiah can draw on here, which is, look at the situation you've created. You must see this is a bad situation. This is wrong. This is the opposite of what you should be doing. And they recognize it. Okay. So what's interesting is this kind of takes us in a way full circle, because the whole question of why did not exactly full circle, but why in Old Babylonian did they do these kind of freeing? Was it ethics? It's a question. Was it actually ethical? Was it really to set up justice? Was it some kind of was it some kind of propaganda? Was it for economic reasons? Right? Of course, they present it as being justice, but I think that here it's pretty clear. I mean, here it's certainly set up that this is a very painful situation. This is a very, very painful situation. Certainly a leader like Nehemiah, who is living among the people, as it were, is going to want to make sure that there isn't, in many of his things, he wants to maintain justice and fairness and the way things ought to be. And he's able to call on, without it being only just a one-way edict, he's able to call on kind of the morality of the people of really kind of placing it in front of them. And I think that's a reason why this doesn't seem to be reversed when Tzidkiyahu's was. It sounds like when under Tzidkiyahu, he forced it as king, or maybe they just didn't agree with him. They didn't really, it wasn't as easy to say, look, guys, you're wrong. But Nehemiah is able to do that. So that just having a law in the books isn't enough, right? And you have to have kind of the leader be able to step in, and you have to have the people be able to say, oh yeah, this is wrong. I'm going to take a pause here and look at your comments. So I've touched the Torah's prohibition of extraditing an escaped or freed slave to his or her master apply only to Hebrew slaves or also to Canaanite slaves. The way I remember it, I have to look at it again, but the way I remember it was it didn't say Eved Ivri there. It just said Eved. It just said slave. And they're coming, and it's a slave from a different city. It sounded like any slave. But I have to look at it again, okay? Because I remember, I have to look at it again. The way I remember it, it sounded like any slave. But I have to look at it again, and I have to look at it in context to make sure. From Elisa to everyone, I recently learned that na in modern Hebrew doesn't mean a polite please. It connotes you must do the following, e.g. na l'shalem. Right, na is not please. It's easy for us to translate it please because we need that kind of word. It's not a word that translates easily into English. It's a thing saying, okay, now do this, right? Sometimes it seems more polite, and sometimes it seems like it's not, there's someone who's not being polite at all and just saying this is what you should do. Okay, so I just gonna pause a little bit because I'm wrapping up now. So if you have any more questions, now is the time. Okay.
Miriam,
Yeah.
Miriam,
Yeah.
but when this is all fascinating, but like what percentage of the population was enslaved somehow? Do we have any idea?
I don't think we have enough to know.
Okay.
I don't think we have enough to know. We have enough, we have like documents that show these kind of arrangements, but I don't think we have a way of knowing percentage wise. In fact, it's harder to tie a lot of these things together than you'd think. Even in terms of the edicts, the only edict we really have is the edict that I showed you, even though we have references to other edicts through the ages. So as far as I know. And so it's very hard to know exactly how widespread this was at any given moment, particularly since if you have an edict like this, it's gonna free a bunch of people. So if you have some kind of evidence for the next year, it's not real. I can try and look and see if someone has estimates. I would think that even if someone has estimates, they're very shaky. They might present them as not shaky, but I would imagine they're very shaky because it would be hard to estimate something like that because you can't even tell in terms of fields. You can't even check. They can in fact when they talk about how many slaves a palace had, right? So they have more documentation of corvée slaves from the citizens. They can tell how many people they have from the citizens, but they can't tell, it's much harder for them to tell how many foreign slaves they have. In other words, quote unquote, real slaves, because those guys aren't documented as well. So there's a lot of holes with these things. You need the documentation. And as soon as you're in regular landowner territory, which is where we are now, when we talk about these things, we're not talking about palace corvée indentured servants. We're not talking about the temple tenant farmers, which, by the way, temples were big landowners, and they did have people who worked the land for them. In some cases, they were kind of like tenant farmers. Sometimes cases, there was at one stage, it was kind of a charity where they took in the homeless, the widow, the orphan, and they gave them something to do. And then it kind of became, they're almost like slaves. And then there were points, there were some documented points where temples grabbed homeless people and like, okay, you work here now. But these are like, we can only base ourselves on the documents. We've got temples kept documents, palaces kept documents when it was important. So they kept less documents about foreign slaves because they didn't need to. landowners, we happen on the archives. If we don't happen on the archive, we're not going to know a lot. And I think that's why it makes it very hard. And that's one of the reasons why, what do they call that history? When the kind of the common is the history of what it was like to be a person at this time. You can absolutely fill it in, but it's much harder than saying what was it like to be a king, right? Because you have much less documentation. Susan says the priests were not stripped of their land during Joseph's time. Right. So this is the interesting thing. I think what that story is reflecting is the fact that temples were a major landowner, right? In the ancient, in both in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, one assumes. So they continue to own their own land and have their own slaves. There's one theory that Akhenaten, who's the monotheistic, some people say he's henotheistic, whatever. He has the Aten, who's the god, right? And he's like, we're not, that's it, that's the god. So some think that the reason that he did it was because of the rising power of the priesthood, and he wanted to kind of in Thebes, and he wanted to kind of cut that off. So he's like, okay, yeah, this god that no. By the way, just as an aside, Akhenaten, he did fund other temples in other places, but not the main one in Thebes. So it's not like he was so monotheistic that no other temple existed. So just to kind of wrap things up, what I wanted to show today was not just that the problem of debt slavery was a very common one in the ancient Near East, and in fact, it explains to us why when we read about it in Shemot and Exodus, it doesn't have to explain to us why the person was sold into this indentured servitude. We don't need an explanation. We know why. We know what it must have been, right? And that in the ancient Near East as well, there were limits to try in certain places at certain times, there were limits to prevent this kind of total collapse of the agricultural small landowner, right? And his descent into slavery. And that on the one hand, we have kind of the Torah law, which is meant to limit this in terms of forgiving debts and releasing indentured in kind of these debt slaves as well. And at the same time, we also have actual kind of, as it were, historical accounts in biblical stories that tell us about the need for the ruler to step in and say, no. And we see the difference in our own history of when a ruler kind of steps in as one assumes kind of a monarch who's doing it from above, as opposed to Nehemiah, who can actually really appeal, not just to something that people actually believe in and have as shared values, and how he can in that way stop this thing that is clearly an injustice in our eyes, and by that point in everyone's eyes. So I think I hope I gave you kind of more of a background of this idea, both in terms of Tanakh itself, of the Bible itself, and in terms of the ancient Near East as a whole. So, and thank you for joining me.